Biodiversity seminar. Today is the second of 5 sessions that we're running through the month of September, with a theme this year focusing on farming and biodiversity. We've got 2 great speakers lined up for you, which we'll get to in a moment, but before that, we really just send a message out to you all, hoping that your friends and family and loved ones are well during these challenging times that are extending, and that just to acknowledge that we've put this seminar online again just to try and create the best reach that we can. This year we'll be focusing on one of the most important factors in biodiversity conservation at the moment, our farmers. As the principal land managers for such a large area of Victoria, it is really the work that they do to maintain their land and environment that's playing such an increasing role in biodiversity conservation. And we hope you enjoy both Jim and Danny that we have for you today. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging on the lands of where we're all meeting today. For me, I'm participating from Horsham, Victoria, which is the land of the Watchabolek, Jardwa, Jardwajali, Wagaya and Jabbergog peoples, represented by the Brudgegangen Land Council. We recognise their proud traditions, vibrant culture and continued connection to land, water and the community. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the amazing organising group that we have working tirelessly behind the scenes. Hopefully you get to see some of the faces during these 5 sessions as we're changing the host each time. And we also would like to have a huge thank you to recognise their proud organisations that also support us to do this. So we're really grateful to Bank Australia, the Brudgegangen Land Council, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, Trust for Nature, Grampians Wimmera Water and the Wimmera CMA. If you've noticed some of our promotion, you would have probably been stunned and floored by the amazing logo that we have this year. So thank you to Elia Purtle, who was also one of our presenters last week. She's done a great job. As you know, we create a unique logo each year and we try and find a local artist to do that. Just making sure that all participants have the ability to use the chat if they're on Teams, and hopefully we're managing things so that cameras and mics are muted for those. You can put your chats in the box at any time on Teams, and those on YouTube, you've got access to use the email, which I think is showing up for you now. And if you've got any problems, you can just use the email and we're monitoring that at the moment. So that'll be going into the chat. Thank you. I did mention just at the start, but mugs we have available for the first 175 people who've registered. You'll know if you're one of those lucky 175 at the end of September, and I'd like to hope that we can get them to you before Christmas this year, but I don't want to do any promises. And we'll also have a short survey link popped into the chat at the end of the session, which would be great if you could fill out, because it really helps us to improve on the event for future years. I would like to now introduce Dr. Jim Radford, who is our first speaker for today. He's a Principal Research Fellow at La Trobe University. Today he'll be presenting on farm scale natural capital accounting. What is it and why is it good for farmers? Jim has actually already presented once at a biodiversity seminar back in 1998, which is wonderful to have him here for a second time. We don't often have, we do have some repeat people, so it's good. It must mean that you're doing great work continuously. But Jim has extensive research experience in landscape ecology, conservation biology and sustainable agriculture. His work aims to find solutions and develop next generation tools to address global challenge of sustaining natural ecosystems and biodiversity in human dominated landscapes under climate change. Jim completed his PhD on the breeding biology and conservation ecology of the white-browed tree creeper at Deakin University in 2002, and he was a research fellow at Deakin, studying impacts of land use change in agricultural landscapes on bird communities until 2007, when he joined Bush Heritage Australia as their ecological monitoring coordinator. Jim has held several roles with Bush Heritage, including Science Director and Executive Manager of Science and Conservation, until he joined La Trobe Uni at the end of 2016. So a really warm welcome to you, Jim. We feel very grateful that you've got the time available to present at this year's seminar. Looking forward to it, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Pauline, and it's a pleasure to be here again. Unfortunately, not in person. It would have been wonderful to be able to meet in person. Now, I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully this works. And just while I'm doing that, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from on Jar Jar Run country in central Victoria, and extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, I'll just...
I can see your screen.
Yeah, I'll just click to slideshow view. So if you could just let me know when that comes up in slideshow view. It's a little bit of a delay. There we go.
That's there. Yeah, great.
Excellent. Okay, so yes, fantastic. Thanks, Pauline, again. And yeah, what I want to talk to you about today is farm scale and natural capital accounting. Why is it, or what is it, most particularly, and why is it good for farmers, and why is it good for all of us potentially? So to start with, what do these companies have in common? Broad, oh, I've done that. Didn't mean to do that. Am I still sharing? Lost my screen. There we go. Beg your pardon. What do these companies have in common? Broad range of sectors that they work across, from clothing and fashion to food producing or food production, retail, and various entertainment consortia such as the Star. Well, the answer is that they have all made a public commitment or pledge at some level to increase their level of sustainable sourcing of sustainable materials. That where they're getting their products from to produce their clothes or that they're selling in their shops minimises the environmental impact, and where possible reducing their carbon footprint. So you may well have seen recently this ad that's just come on our telly from Coles in the last month or so. So not an apologist for Coles, but please have a listen and listen for some key terms.
From the very beginning, when we dreamed, you helped us make it a reality.
I ain't seen nothing like this before.
All very fuzzy, nice, lovely pictures.
Our Coles farmer partnerships propel us forward. Like fresh beef with no added hormones.
I ain't seen nothing like this.
Responsibly sourced seafood. And ever more responsible ways to grow. Our stores will be powered by renewable electricity by June 2025. Our dream is to be Australia's most sustainable supermarket, but we'll need your help to get there. Introducing Together to Zero. Zero hunger, zero waste, and zero emissions. For generations to come.
Okay, that's enough of that. But what is really interesting is a lot of the words that are now coming through in this advertising. Now, this is just an example. Coles aren't the only one. I noticed that Woolies have followed suit very quickly, but there's many others out there. So key terms in that ad like farmer partnerships, fresh beef with no added hormones, renewable electricity, 100% renewable, zero carbon footprint by 2025, which is a great commitment to make. I applaud them. Dream to be Australia's most sustainable supermarket, zero emissions, zero waste, zero everything, responsibly sourced seafood. And it's not just domestic markets and domestic retailers. International markets are increasingly focused on ensuring carbon neutrality and environmental sustainability in their green agricultural production. Now, companies like Coles aren't doing this just, well, not entirely, certainly because they want to feel good and they want to change the planet. They're doing it because they've recognised that there is a significant portion of their clientele, their customers, that are demanding these things, demanding better animal welfare, demanding more sustainably produced food, and a reduced impact on the planet. So consumer demand is ultimately what is driving these sorts of things. And organisations like Coles need to promote this, and they need to say that they are bending to this will so that they maintain their social licence to operate, as well as maintaining their market share and their profits and their return to shareholders. But it is a key that the consumer demand is driving the social licence to operate. And in return, Coles will be looking for, because farmers and suppliers that can provide that sustainably produced products. So the key here is the sustainable production square. What do we mean by that? There's nothing in the ad that had any, apart from the zero waste and zero emissions, none of the things around sustainable production had any actual definition. It's all pretty wishy-washy. It's a little bit fluffy. There's no quantitative targets. There's no definition of what they mean by sustainable production. But generally, what we can think of is a number of these elements, plus others, this is a subset of them, that go into produce sustainable production. So there needs to be space for biodiversity in nature, both on the farm and in the broader landscape.
To apply a cooling preset.
The production systems need to provide public benefit services, and they will do so if they're being produced sustainably. Things like increased carbon sequestration, production of clean water through better waterway management, provision of habitat for biodiversity and landscape amenity. Animal welfare is increasingly becoming an important component of sustainable production, and there's other there's certification and methods around to address that. And an equitable and responsible use of resources. So how are you using your natural capital on the farm? How is a producer using the natural capital on the farm? Are they expiring and just using up without replenishing the soil stocks? Are they using the native vegetation resources that are provided and everything else that goes into building the farm's production system? Are they looking after that and replenishing that so that it is managed in a sustainable way? So that's all good and well, but there's really no agreed methods and tools by which farmers can actually prove to Coles, in this instance, that they are doing these things and that Coles can have complete transparency and confidence in their supply chain that they can then pass on to their customers. So what if I could prove it to you? What if I could give you a tool that addresses this critical gap in agribusiness by enabling farmers to measure and demonstrate their environmental credentials to their stakeholders, including their buyers of their products, that would actually close this gap, that would fill in one of these key gaps in that chain of from the consumer to the social license to operate to the sustainable agriculture that I showed on the last slide. So this is where accounting comes into it. Now, I'm a bit surprised, as most of you know, or many of you may or may not know, I'm generally more concerned with this side of the slide. When I presented back in 1998, I think it was about calitris and white-browed tree creepers, and I've spent my career looking at birds and other types of biodiversity, largely in modified landscapes, many of them agricultural landscapes. So I tend to have been concentrating on the right-hand side of this screen. But some recent collaborations in the last few years have started to convince me quite compellingly that actual fact accounting, which we usually associate with these relatively, these very dry terms and concepts, actually has a large role to play in this, and particularly farm scale natural capital accounting. So back to basics. What do we mean when we say natural capital? Well, we use a very broad definition, and that's fairly well accepted as the definition of natural capital. It's essentially the stock of all renewable and non-renewable resources, natural resources, that when combined yield a flow of benefits to people. So that includes plant material, animal material, soils, water, air and minerals that are part of, in this case, production systems. So if we were to take that into a farming context, agricultural landscape, this is obviously just an exemplar demonstration of what we might mean by this. So a very mixed farm in this case that has both biological assets such as the native vegetation and the pasture and the crops, the livestock, any shelter belts and mature scattered trees and the like, as well as ecological assets. And by that, I generally mean the interplay, the interaction between those different biological assets that that yield a flow of ecosystem services, and in many cases, ecosystem benefits. But we're also talking about the soil that's underpinning the whole system, the flow of surface water and groundwater, the interaction between the riparian systems and the terrestrial systems, and basically all of the natural elements that underpin the agricultural system. So what do we mean by natural capital accounting? Well, like financial accounting, it's simply a set of rules. It's basically a standardized set of concepts and methods to quantify and to count and to measure the resources that go into farm production, and where we can, to estimate the contribution that they make to agricultural production and therefore the financial outputs and the financial returns of the farm individually and society as a whole. So essentially, it's a set of accounting standards. Now, we are doing this in physical terms. So I'll give some examples of this in a minute, but essentially the accounts are prepared in terms of the area that a particular type of natural capital might take up on a farm, or the physical transformation in terms of gas emissions or drawdown or outflow from a farm. So generally prepared in physical terms, in recognition that in most cases that's the actual management levers that farmers can use to manage their properties and manage manage their natural capital. But we are also, where we can, trying to prepare the accounts in monetary terms. So to recognise that natural capital does have a monetary value when it can be translated into the agricultural products that are produced on a property, and therefore can be equated to a monetary value. And in this project, we are taking very much an enterprise scale approach. So we're looking at individual farms and preparing sets of accounts specifically at that farm scale. So going back to our cartoon farm, these are the agricultural assets that are traditionally measured and accounted for in a financial accounting sense. So yes, there are some of the biological assets in terms of the actual products that are taken off a farm. So it might be wool or meat from livestock. It might be crops, might be pasture that's baled and sold as hay or silage. Obviously the plant equipment and the infrastructure such as fences and tractors and the like it appears on the balance sheet, appears on the books, both in terms of as an asset and the depreciation value. And the land itself is accounted for in traditional accounting systems. So all of these things do appear on the books, but all of these things, which are the ecological assets that underpin the farming system, are completely invisible to traditional accounting methods. So this takes into no account the soil quality and how that's being managed, the water resources, the natural capital that's held up or that's contained in pasture, in shelter belts, in scattered trees, in patches of remnant vegetation, and importantly in riparian strips. So what we're trying to do is essentially put these elements on the books as well, because we recognise that they generate significant inflows of economic benefit. So we know that in many cases these ecological assets provide private benefit for the producer. So things like shade and shelter for livestock, forage for livestock and fodder for sale in some cases. The soil biology and the soil condition contributes to composting functions, nutrient cycling, water infiltration and retention that underpins primary production. In many cases, native vegetation, be it in blocks or shelter belts or field margins, provide habitat for many beneficial insects, pollinators, natural enemies, species that participate in waste decomposition and the like. However, many of the ecological assets on a farm also produce public benefit goods. So protection of waterways from leaching and soil erosion, so for cleaner waterways, conserving habitat for biodiversity and landscape amenities, storing and sequestering carbon to try and mitigate the impacts of climate change. In many cases, there's a joint benefit. These elements provide both public and private benefits that we've just talked about. But in some cases, the public wants farmers to have more of some of these elements on their farm than is actually at the sort of optimal amount for greatest private benefit. So, if we want a farmer to conserve more, store and sequester more carbon than might be optimal for their production system, then incentives need to be paid, or other systems such as carbon farming initiatives, carbon programs need to be developed to provide that incentive for the farmer to go above and beyond the optimum for their private benefit. Likewise for conserving habitat and biodiversity and protecting waterways. So there's areas where joint benefit needs to be stimulated. And we do recognise that in some cases, some elements of natural capital can provide disbenefits, such as habitat for pests. So in natural capital accounting, we're simply trying to measure the extent and condition of these different types of natural capital on a farm and the contribution that they make to the farming business and to the public good. We measure how natural capital is managed, that's included in the accounts, and whether this is expected to change the type and extent and condition of natural capital over time, and indeed if it does, and thus how its management affects the resource use efficiency of the products that are produced off the farm and any externalities or bad outcomes that are generated as a consequence. So to do this, we basically start with a fine-scale map of the farm that maps all of the different ecosystem types that are present on a farm, so the forest types, the woodlands, native grasslands, croplands, grazing lands, and other, it might be more intensive habitat, more intensive land use such as horticulture or vineyards as well. Maps them according to their land use and their condition. We try and do that, well, we are doing this remotely using remote imagery and ground cover estimates going back 5 years. We then do an on-ground validation survey so that we validate what we're seeing from space is actually what's happening on the ground. So there's some on-site ecological and operational data collection. There's a lot of information that's produced through the farmer's accountants or their farm business advisor in terms of their inputs to the production, fertiliser, seed production, fossil fuels, chemical use, and these sorts of things, which go in to generate a lot of the account outputs that I'll show in a second. So that we have a fine-scale map of the farm, of what's happening on the farm. And this all goes into a very detailed asset register, which records the type of asset, natural capital asset on a property, how big it is, what its condition is, and what its land uses are. And from this, we can roll this up and generate a whole series of different types of accounts. So we're building these farm-scale natural capital accounts for 50 farms in southeastern Australia and New South Wales, central northern Victoria and the Midlands of Tasmania. We're using machine learning, remote sensing technology and flexible data capture technology on the ground, integrated into our farm-scale natural capital account digital platform to hopefully enable rapid upscaling upon completion of this proof of concept project, so that we can take this from 50 farms to 500 farms to 5,000 farms relatively simply. We think that this is the foundation of a project that could transform the Australian landscape by empowering farmers to demonstrate their environmental credentials and leverage market access and financial rewards across a whole range of different systems. So what do these accounts actually look like? Well, the basic summary is this sort of summary of the physical ecosystem assets that occur on a property. Now, this is a hypothetical example, and this particular farm had an assessment done in 2015 and was reassessed last year, hypothetically. It had a whole range of different natural capital types or ecosystem types, such as agroforestry, grassy woodlands that were used for grazing. Some might be tucked away for biodiversity primarily, but they are part of the production system still if they're grazed. Had some riparian areas that probably may well have been fenced off or accessed occasionally. Cleared native pastures, exotic pastures, had some cropping that was both dry land and irrigated, had some shelter belts. So the accounts is really just a summary of the aerial extent in the first instance of these different types of natural capital that occur on a farm. Now, if a farmer undertakes some sort of management change, that's reflected in the accounts. So between the two sampling periods in this hypothetical example, 39 hectares of poor quality exotic pasture was converted to an agroforestry system. 31 hectares of reasonable quality naturalised pasture, by that sort of it's exotic but sown pasture, was converted into shelter belts to improve shade and wind protection for stock or crops. And they undertook some grazing management changes. They might have moved to a more rotational grazing system, or they might have upped the inputs, or they might have sown some. Well, no, they didn't sown pasture because this is native pastures here. But we see a change in the aerial extent in terms of the condition state of different grassy woodlands or grassland systems. In this naturalised pasture, these improvements here may have been due to, sowing down some perennial pastures or something like that. So it's not necessarily all just about the biodiversity aspect of it. You can get improvements in your natural capital through inputs, but we do need to look at the long-term impacts of any of those changes as well. So that's the basic physical summary. We also generate, based on the previous 5 years, but annually, a greenhouse gas emission and sequestration balance sheet, which takes into account all of the farm's operational inputs, where they have livestock, the enteric emissions and different emissions that are resulting from livestock. This is based on industry standard models, and we're trying to improve these as we go. And any pre-farm greenhouse gas emissions as well, related from transport of farm inputs and livestock and the like. The total amount of sequestration on the property is estimated using Flint Pro, which is basically full cam modelling, but improved, and an estimation of the soil stocks as well, to generate a annual carbon balance. Now, this is actually real data from a grazing property in Tasmania, large grazing property, that when the numbers were run, it seems that it's apparent that it's actually a net carbon sequester based on the amount of native vegetation and the pastures that they're running on the property, which was a surprise, a pleasant one. Based on the Kering environmental profit and loss statement, we also produce this sort of measure of resource use intensity per unit metric, or per unit of output produced. In this case, it's a wool producer. So for each kilogram of greasy wool that's produced on the property, we provide an estimate of the amount of water pollution. So in this case, the kilograms of nitrogen that might be leached. As we mentioned, the greenhouse gas emissions, water use efficiency, standardised to the regional evapotranspiration rates, so normalised stressed weight water consumption. Estimates of nitrogen and potentially phosphorus use as well, lime use efficiency, these sorts of things. So what are your inputs relative to your outputs? In this project, we are trying to take the contribution or the impact on farm biodiversity to the next level as well. So we're undertaking a research project alongside the compilation project, if it counts, to look at how do these measures of biodiversity, measures of natural capital, beg your pardon, that end up in the accounts, how well do they relate to the biodiversity that's on a farm? So we're looking at a number of different ways in which we can measure biodiversity and the metrics that we can use. Remembering that we won't have the luxury of being able to do the detailed surveys that we're doing as part of this project in the future when we scale it up to 500 and 5,000 farms. So we need to relate these back to some sort of measure that we can look at from space or other data sets that are available remotely. So we're looking at things like departure from reference community, connectivity on the farm, the persistence of particular types of native vegetation cover and ecosystem integrity, the diversity and the heterogeneity of the ecosystems and the production systems on a farm. We're also looking at a number of what we're calling fauna-mediated but agriculturally relevant ecosystem services. So pollination, pest control, waste decomposition, soil biology, nutrient and cycling and carbon storage and things like that. So that, again, related to the measures of natural capital that go into the accounts, we might be able to generate some of these ecosystem service contributions. Is there a zone of native pollination? Is there a zone of pest suppression? What's the contribution of natural capital to water holding capacity, decomposition? When we talk about natural capital, it's not just native vegetation. It's the condition of the soil. It's the cover and the diversity of pastures that might be on a grazing property. It's your cropping regime and how the soil interface and the depth of productive soil in a system as well. So it goes beyond just native vegetation and buffers and shelter belts and things like that. So, in summary, Summary 1. We think that the farm-scale natural capital accounts, well, they are a standardised, verifiable and repeatable method to measure the stocks in natural capital at a particular point in time. And by doing repeated measures at different points in time, we can estimate the change or the flows in those natural capital. So get at trends. As you've seen, we recognise that there's many different aspects to the environmental performance of an entire farm. And so we're going to need different metrics to represent those different aspects of environmental performance as it might relate to ecosystem integrity, carbon balance or sequestration, soil condition, resource use efficiency and impacts on biodiversity. Excuse me. We think that the farm-scale natural capital accounts complement the traditional financial accounts to provide an expanded view of farm performance and profitability. And we consider how natural capital and ecosystem function contribute to farm performance. What's their, contribute to farm performance and agricultural production. But on the other side of that is how does the agricultural production impact some of those elements of biodiversity, natural capital and ecosystem function as well. So it works both ways. We think that the natural capital accounts provide a direct line of sight for natural capital assets that benefit production. So directly connecting the natural capital on a farm to the agricultural production benefits. There are a number of other measures that are out there, accounting for nature's econs and other environmental economic accounting methods. And this isn't we aren't saying that natural capital accounts are better or worse than that necessarily, but in fact they can incorporate those measures as they relate to particular components on a farm, so they can contribute to the condition measuring that's part of the accounting process. So we see that natural capital accounting very much complements those other processes that are out there as well, and that in fact it's a broad tent, a large tent, broad church, whatever the term is, but that natural capital accounting does in fact complement those other metrics. We hope that farmers can use the accounts to determine where improvements to farm management can be made to improve their environmental health and sustainability, but also that it can unlock and uncover opportunities to improve farm productivity and profitability through managing that natural capital better. And by demonstrating some of these public benefit services that are provided by natural capital on farm, potentially open up new income streams some farmers may not have been aware of, such as habitat credits, stewardship payments, and new ones that might come along. Importantly, it will communicate a farm's environmental performance to a large range of stakeholders. So going back to the very start of this, they can say to Coles, here's my set of accounts, here's my environmental performance going back 5 years, 10 years. You look at that, it's transparent, it's visible, it's repeatable, it's verifiable. You can now tell your customers that you're getting your pork or your beef or your whatever it is from a farm that is on a journey to sustainability. Equally useful for talking to lenders, investors, insurers, and those sorts of things, those sorts of stakeholders as well. So really, it increases visibility of resource condition through the supply chain to facilitate collective, and by that I mean whole of society, management of resources, ideally. So, in short, I think you'll now agree that farm-scale natural capital accounting can save the planet, that it's a new way of measuring the environmental performance of farming and showing the sustainability of agricultural products. Now, I've talked about it in a farming sense, but it could just as easily be incorporated into a conservation property or that an NGO might be running. Farm-scale natural capital accounting is a whole of farm system of environmental economic accounting that's enabled by, in our case, an integrated digital platform to generate what we're calling ecologically calibrated enterprise scale natural capital accounts. And in doing so, as I've mentioned, farmers will be able to demonstrate their environmental credentials and market this to their advantage. This reinforces positive and proactive management of natural capital, increasing environmental sustainability, climate resilience and profitability, hopefully, by creating a virtuous cycle from paddock to market. In return, markets will be incentivised to reward farmers who are working with natural capital to produce the food we eat and the fibres that we wear. In essence, farm-scale natural capital accounting brings globally recognised measures of environmental performance to the farm gate. It empowers farmers to demonstrate their sustainability credentials in ways that are relevant now and will be even more so, even more important in the future as trade tariffs and barriers on carbon and environmental impact and footprints are incorporated into global markets. So I think I've probably gone over time, so I will stop there.
Thanks, Jim.
And there we go, stop sharing.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's interesting, isn't it? Because describing things in different types of languages, including accounting, which is very evidence-based, very repeatable, just also speaks to a different audience as well. Those of us who love to go out there and love to listen to the birds, like you've got going on in your background, we're motivated by other means than those who might be more motivated by money. And it's always been the hardest challenge in conservation, to speak languages to those who we find to provide different motivations to different groups of people. So yeah, your work is great in helping to demonstrate that. And I do want to know what birds are going on in your background.
Sorry, point this. So there's two superb fairy wrens that hassle me all day, every day long at this time of the year. I've got big windows there, and they can see their reflection on them, and they're chirping away there. Probably also grey shrike thrush out there that's they're very active at the moment.
It's a lovely sound.
And it's interesting on the monetarisation. I'm not sure how much time I've got, but on the monetarisation side of things, just want to be clear that we're only putting attempts to put monetary values on those things that relate to the production system. So we're not suggesting, because just talking about birds and that sort of thing, that we can put a monetary value on those more esoteric, biodiversity values. What's a superb fairy wren worth? In its own sense, we can hopefully say what's a superb fairy wren worth in terms of its pest control that it might contribute to a farm. And probably an individual fairy wren, it's probably pretty low, but it's something, and collectively it would add up. So the monetarisation side of things is in relation to the services that contribute to agricultural production collectively, not the inherent value of it, because that is going to be such a value judgment.
Yep. Yeah, it always is, isn't it? Now, we do have a few questions, and I don't think we'll be able to get to them all. There's a particularly longer one that I might get you to answer afterwards, but we'll start here because a few people are interested in what does this mean for farmers in terms of, and I'm editorialising here because I was thinking similar things, about getting an accreditation and, what does it mean in localised markets versus national markets, particularly when we've got different things happening in the climate change space that could put limiting things on Australian producers. What are your thoughts there? So
we're working towards a blueprint as part of this project, and one of the unresolved issues is where is that blueprint, which have become the standards? Who owns that? Who recognises that? And who, where does that sit? So we've got, and I see another question there around the VFF. We haven't spoken to the VFF particularly, but the NFF is very much on our advisory committee and are very supportive of this work. So they're umbrella organisation. And one of the things that Warwick Ragg from the NFF continually warns me about is to steer away from using accreditation terminology that has very specific meanings, and it can put a lot of burden and a lot of it can become overburdening for farmers to take it up. So I think we're moving towards standardisation as our sort of framework. So we want to be for the accounts to be standardised, like financial accounts are standardised. There's a set of rules that are agreed by those that are the practitioners of developing the accounts, the accountants. But they're like, for this, we need a set of rules by which natural capital accounts are standardised, and that, in a way, is the confidence that the marker that says, okay, these are fair income for a particular farm. Now, I'm still not quite sure who that sits with, whether it's a new body, whether it's accounting in nature, whether it's a government organisation. But they do need to be standardised. Then it's up to the farmer as to how they want to use their accounts. So they might a number of the farmers of the 50 that were involved in this project just want it for their own benefit. They want to know that what they're doing is leaving the land in a better state. Their condition is improving, their natural capital is improving for passing it on to their kids or selling it or whatever it might be. Not from a financial gain perspective, although that could come into it as well, but just from a well-being perspective, basically. Others want to, use it to increase market access. There's a number of examples that are basically one-to-one relationships where niche buyers, source their products from a number of farmers who can demonstrate their low impact, their light touch on the land, and we're hoping that these accounts can help those sorts of farmers. A number of them are in our program already. Increasingly, I would like to see, when the day comes that the EU only imports agricultural products that have some level of surety around their environmental impact, whether it's their carbon footprint or their biodiversity footprint. Our goal, our big ambition is that the accounts are the standard that's used for that, or some version of them.
Yeah, that would be great. And is there any other similar work happening like what you're doing, or is this really?
So there is. So as I mentioned, I made mention of, for example, the accounting for nature methods, which are similar in that they're standardised. They're what's the condition of a patch or part of your land standardised to a benchmark. Now their focus is on is more on natural areas. So what's the woodland in your system or the grassland in your system benchmarked to the reference condition. They have a production value as well, which is how close is it to the optimised production for soil or soil carbon and things like that. So that's, and we think that they sit very nicely together, that those sort of approaches can be embedded into the accounts and can be used to inform condition states. There are others such as the land to market ecological outcomes verification. So a number of the people online may have heard of that as well, which is that has a stronger focus on the production areas of a farm. And it has a very rigorous and intense resampling and remonitoring regime that's associated with that. So
I might have to, sorry, Jim, I might have to pull up there, only that just to leave ourselves a bit of time.
Yeah.
If you had time after this, it would be wonderful, because now you're flushing out a whole pile of questions. A lot of them are detail based. If you had time in between, it'd be lovely if you could pop some answers in the chat there to various people.
I'll try and reply to them.
That'd be great. And we will also make a link to your website, because I think there was a question there about how do people get in touch with your work? And yeah, the best way to do that would be wonderful.
Yeah, we've got a newsletter that they can sign up for there as well.
Great.
So
yeah. Well, if you had any of those, pop them in the chat. But thank you so much. Would have been great to continue on, but we better leave some time for Danny, otherwise he might get dark on us. Thanks very much, Jim. We really appreciated that. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Danny Pettingle, who is our next speaker for this morning. And I love the Costa bombs we're getting every now and then. Costa, as your video goes on and off. Nice to see that you could join us again today. So Danny is the Landcare Facilitator and Project Officer for Loddon Plains Landcare Network. He runs a private consultancy called Fartail Environments, specialising in landscape management and drone operations in the land management and agricultural industries. Danny is a director of the Landcare Victoria Incorporated and sits on the City of Greater Bendigo Farming and Agribusiness Advisory Committee. Danny was included in the top 12 finalists of the Landcare Australia's 2020 Bob Hawke Landcare Award. And, oh, actually, no, not 2020. Was it 2020, Danny? Or this year? I thought it was this year. You can correct me when we get there. And was the recipient of the 2019 Victorian Government's Our Catchment, Our Communities Leadership in Innovation Development Grant. He loves sharing knowledge and skills and has a passion. He's really committed to industry and lectures quite often with Bendigo TAFE, mentor and conservation and land management and agriculture students. He enjoys assisting practitioners and communities to better understand the links between landscape, water, soils, biodiversity, and the role people play in shaping environments through conservation and agricultural intervention. So very warm welcome to you as well, Danny. Look forward to your presentation. I'll
Thanks,
hand it
Paul.
over to you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Pauline. Thanks for that introduction. I'll just jump in here and hopefully everybody perhaps not gets that. Has everybody got my screen? I seem to have lost it.
We've only got your desktop by the looks of this.
Okay, how's that?
No, not the presentation.
Any better?
I think it might be coming. Those little internet mice are having to get on the wheel and run a bit harder. There we go.
All right,
Yes.
wonderful. There we go. We got there. I think I was trying to do something tricky with my monitor setup, but yeah, something didn't like it. Yes, thanks very much. As somebody pointed out, I got very confused about that Bob Hawke Award myself, but I think it was 2020, presented in 2021, and the ultimate winner was Andrew Stewart, who is doing some wonderful work in Victoria in the kind of area of forestry and habitat restoration. So I congratulate him for all of the work he's doing. So I'm here to talk about designing resilient and adaptive landscapes within community, or with a kind of community-led or community-based focus. Just to begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this country and the land on which we meet today. For me, that's the Dja Dja Wurrung people. I acknowledge the rich living cultures, traditions and the connections of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people and their intrinsic connection to the land that we live and work on. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to the emerging leaders in that space that we're seeing more and more of, which I really commend them on the work that they're doing. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the Dja Dja Wurrung, Barappa Barappa and the Wamba Wamba people. They're the traditional owners of the land on which I live and I work, and I extend that to the land on which you're on today and acknowledge the people and the culture of that place. So I just want to start here, managing for healthy landscapes and biodiversity. And I just want to pose a few questions just in the context of the presentation today to start to think about. So how do you look at a landscape? How do we look at landscapes when we're standing in the middle of a paddock, when we're kind of kicking the grass or get to a new area or just appreciating it for what it is? How do we actually look at it? How do we think about the management and the systems-based or long-term stewardship approaches that we can take to this? And this is on public or private land that I'm talking about here. And what does it mean to assess and to manage for landscape health on a catchment and a micro-catchment scale? And what I'm getting at there is it might be a really large station property, it might be a series of like-minded kind of land managers that are connected within a catchment, or we know that there are these micro-catchments on even smaller kind of parcels of land or land that we manage for either conservation, biodiversity or for agriculture. And so by understanding the requirements of a landscape through these observations, basic or developed monitoring practices, we're able to provide decision-making tools to create systems that are more resilient and therefore they're more productive for biodiversity and for farming. And by identifying the requirements, we can start to think through these management kind of practices and provide systems-based solutions and frameworks for more productive landscapes and more productive enterprises. So I just wanted to touch on this. These are themes that we're starting to see. They're not new. We all talk about them. They're across different landscape management kind of, I suppose, factors. But we're starting to see these trends occur. So we're losing our vegetation. We're getting hotter and drier landscapes. We've got decrease in transpirations. Really kind of degraded soils that we're starting to find. And this is leading to a number of things. So reduction in succession of plant communities, plant community senescence, and the inability to adapt or keep up with adaptation, and also ultimately interruption of the natural cycles, so water, solar, mineral. And we can kind of put this down, all of this kind of synthesizes into this loss of community dynamics or loss of biodiversity that seems to be the ultimate challenge for us today. And so what we're starting to develop here is a kind of conceptual project framework, and this has come about through our Catchment, Our Communities Leadership Innovation program from a couple of years ago that I was lucky enough to be funded to start to pursue. And what this comes down to is 4 main project outcomes that we're looking at, whether we're looking at private land or whether we can undertake it through a community group such as Landcare. And so we want to start with landscape assessment and recognise the intentions and the landscape assets. What's the requirement of the landscape and what's the landscape function, and what's underrepresented or absent and what's required in order to restore that function from the landscape. So this is a really important place to start. A lot of the time, or so often we see this with wonderful intentions, these projects that don't actually start with assessing a landscape or kind of understanding what the underlying issues are there, and we see a plant community that might go in, but ultimately it'll fail because the wrong plants are going in for the state of the soil or the state of the landscape. What we can then move into is an implementation phase. So we can understand the design parameters through the landscape assessment, and then we can look at methods of delivery and the requirements. So are we revegetating? Are we repairing? Are we conserving or restoring? And we can start to target species in order to do this. So, do we need things like pioneers in the landscape, or is it in good enough shape to be able to get some rare, threatened, or kind of underrepresented species in there? Then we move into our delivery. So understanding the delivery outcomes with a clear long-term vision or a clear long-term goal that we can start to build on year by year, and kind of in respect to that, start to repair the landscape function and provide those qualities to the landscape. If it is that we're starting from a degraded landscape, perhaps we can roll that into kind of allowing opportunities for rare or absent or those threatened species to start to occur or start to be introduced down the track. But we need to start with those building blocks in order for that support to happen. And then monitoring, so building continual monitoring in order so that we can start to understand what's working, but it also allows us to adapt where things aren't working. Just as Jim's examples were used, if we can see gains, then it means that perhaps we're doing the right thing. But if things start to drop off, or if it's kind of pretty stable, then maybe that's an indicator that you need to do something else within that management strategy in order to kind of up those biodiversity levels or what you're aiming for. So yes.
So sorry to interrupt. I wonder if you turned off your camera, that might help. We're having a little bit of bandwidth issue, I think, with people seeing your slides.
Yeah, sure.
So sorry to interrupt. It is good to see your face. This might just help us out a little bit. Thanks.
Okay. Let's go. Hopefully this is a bit better. So I suppose summarising that, what this allows us to do is it allows us to design long-term establishment and long-term goals and long-term planning. It's transferable across stewardship outcomes and transferable across systems. So we can start to look at enterprise versus biodiversity and conservation values, or we can start to mesh those together, and that's the ultimate goal, is to bring that together. And it's developed to provide flexibility in decision making for both those enterprise and biodiversity outcomes. So this was the first example of the framework kind of being put in place. This was a pilot kind of project that Loddon Plains Landcare Network was delivering alongside the framework that was happening. And so we decided to implement it. And So this particular project, it was designed in collaboration with local community, with traditional owners and with the local landcare groups. And ultimately, there were a number of outcomes that we needed to, or that we wanted to provide, that were both kind of short-term and long-term. One of which was to get a bit more vegetation on that lunette. As you can see, it's quite sparse in that particular area. But another really important consideration for traditional owners was to continue to develop habitat for the red-tailed black cockatoo. And so there was a focus on the native pine and casuarina species and the associated plant community that was absent from the landscape that supported those particular species. So what fell out of that was, within the project design, we could implement things to include diversity in genetic material, species that are absent or underrepresented, using different suppliers and provenance in order to build the resilience and the adaptation levels within the project. And we used our benchmarkers of using 50% of the associated plant community that should be in the landscape, and 50% of the genera that make up the plant community. And the reason for that is often we do see the same kind of species going in or being rotated through projects. And we wanted to try and move away from that and kind of challenge ourselves a little bit more in the project delivery to really think about what could go into these projects and into these activities. And of course, we built capacity to monitor from the outset. So each one of those plant guards also has a coloured tag, and that refers back to where we sourced the seed from. So if you can see those kind of coloured areas, each of those areas is where we were able to source seed from for this particular program, and we can monitor that as the years go by to see how that kind of genetic material is kind of going within the landscape there. So yeah, as you can see, the challenges that we touched on here, really changing climate. There was pretty low rainfall with historical salinity problems, and effective long-term drying, really sandy soils, and particularly a lack of abundance in species. So we were able to also include things like cattlebush, sugarwood, Parmelia daisy bush, the casuarina species, and 6 species that were absent from the landscape within a kind of protected and associated plant community to see how they do as the kind of years go by. So developing this a little bit further, what we've now come up with and I suppose the defining question around this was, how can we support this framework to assist in plant selection for both private land use and NRM kind of activities that also supports landscape function or provides the kind of maximum benefit to a program for both biodiversity values and for project success. And we've landed on this, which we've termed the Plains Plant Selection Matrix, which can often be a bit of a mouthful. What it does is it brings together it's over 300 plants now across the central Victorian goldfields and riverine bioregions, and particularly around the plains and those associated areas, plus a series of common species used for secondary agriculture applications. So, a very common one, and where landcare was really built off, was forestry and forestry plots. Fodder and silvopasture systems are becoming very, very popular in terms of, or they're gaining popularity in terms of trying to implement those sorts of systems, and of course shelter belts and the like. So what this does is it provides a guide for kind of designing and planting these projects, or landscape and landscape use design and function, through species selection by using around 20 different attributes. So that might be looking at pioneers, it might be looking at building habitat, fixing salinity or erosion issues, or pushing the water table down, or kind of soil conditioning or food sources. So Jim touched on the wild populations that we want to start to see more reliance on within a farming system or an agricultural space. So food sources for wild pollinators and wild kind of species is really crucial within that. And as you can see down here on the right hand side, an extension of this plant matrix now, we're starting to develop a kind of flowering calendar. So depending on how deep users want to go into this, they can start to select for their attributes and understand what's flowering when or what's developing within the plant community at what stage to be able to provide a year-round food source or as close to as possible. And kind of that can then start to, I suppose, factor in these wild species and native species and wild pollinators and the like, woodland birds and nectar eaters and those types of things. But it can also start to work into a kind of fodder-based system, so a silvopasture system or a native pasture system and the like. So ultimately what it does is allow users to select plants according to the landscape function requirements and according to their landscape assessment, and provides a guide for appropriate project development to encourage a greater species depth and greater kind of landscape restoration value. And so what we're starting to see out of that, and some learnings that are starting to kind of emerge from that, or some advice, is, and this is where the rubber kind of meets the road, really. It's putting together the reasons or the why of doing this in order for greater adoption. So what's come out of that for farm and for landscape is using shelter belts as these arcs as a basis for natural improvements for larger areas. That can be well designed and and kind of take into account access from all sides, for instance. And what that can start to do is provide greater benefits for stock. So it's very, very clear now that stock do enjoy being able to kind of choose where they can be within wind direction or for environment or elemental protection, I suppose. And I think ANU, the Sustainable Farms, have done a really key piece of research around that that is pretty popular. It also can start to help with our soil moisture and wind effect. So not just talking about pasture, but within cropping context as well. It provides greater root profiles, so we can start to get some better soil conditioning and better soil moisture. We can start to slow surface water, and by slowing it, we remove that those erosion issues that we can come up against, but also provide maximum potential for that soil moisture to stay within the landscape and not kind of go into drains, into our creek system and water system without doing the job that it's required to do. And of course, ultimately, we find greater species abundance. A really key point here is, again, a trend over kind of delivering projects both on private and public land. We can see a lot of overplanting of trees, and so we want to try and start to avoid the overplanting of trees and getting a greater strata of things like shrubs, grasses, ground covers, and get that density. And what that does is it kind of brings down your kind of wind protection, so it creates a more dense area for that type of protection, creates greater habitat opportunity for birds, woodland birds, reptiles and the like, but it also provides some really good benefit on private land and really good landscape benefit and landscape function. Working with remnants and planning around them, so being able to kind of do that, they're already providing that opportunity, and they'll develop a lot faster through that kind of active management and through improvements. So that's kind of fallen out of this as well. And what we're starting to see putting value on this is the exploration of native foods and other type of artisan type markets. So I mentioned Andrew Stewart before, Yan Yan Gert West Farm, their operation through undertaking these types of activities, absolutely unrelated to London Plains Landcare Network or me. Andrew's and Rowan down there have been doing it for a very long time and been pioneers in the field. But they're going into wild cut flowers or native cut flowers, for instance, and using those types of species to perform greater biodiversity function, but also provide an enterprise function for them as well. So what we're kind of working towards now, and what we're starting to do is this is designed for boots on the ground. It's if you like, and Jim, I hope I'm not putting words in your project mouth, but what we want to see is an entry-level point for farmers and landholders to be able to start to adopt some of these practices in order to develop their knowledge and then develop their practices into something more complex, like what Jim presented this morning prior to me. So this is where we're starting to develop a very, very simple method to be able to just get farmers and landholders familiar with doing this sort of thing so that they can start to see the value in their enterprise. And that starts with monitoring and collecting data, because you can then start to understand the landscape on a kind of in a more minute type of detail. So what Reading Landscapes does is it provides a way of adapting or adopting a system to assess a landscape for management and decision making. You can then understand your landscape in more detail, but we can start to focus on really simple benefits like maintaining ground cover and what that does for your soil condition, managing for biodiversity, as Jim talked about, starting to put value on managing for biodiversity and what that can bring to your farming program or to your project. We're starting to touch on carbon and how that can become a secondary enterprise, and looking at things like stock management and native pasture and those sorts of things. And the key aim is to provide an entry level, or at the beginning of a journey towards understanding these types of applications to be able to kind of put into your system. Initially, the program, we've focused on 5 sites in central Victoria, and they've been selected for differing land management priorities and methods. So that's cropping, forestry, rotational grazing, or set stocking, and some conservation as well, and just starting to try and see what that brings. And the method involved here is it's pretty simple. It's readily adoptable. And draws on a number of things. So we're looking at pollinators through a very simple insect hotel, really trendy at the moment. We see it everywhere. Anybody that's on social media or any of that is starting to see the influence that these are having. We're looking at penetrometer readings, a vegetation and grassland score, which I actually nicked off Nick Schultz, as a kind of pasture score, but it's a really, really, really easy way for people to be able to enter into having a look at their ground cover and understanding, the result of higher ground cover versus grazing right down to soil, for instance. We're looking at the abundance of small birds and invertebrates and the overall kind of makeup of the plant community, particularly in strata. So how many trees, how many shrubs, how many grasses, that sort of thing. And we're introducing landscape imagery through drones. So we might take a 2-hectare block, stitch it all together, and what that allows us to do is find some metrics around ground cover, but also find some metrics around kind of landscape value. So what's the canopy like? What does it look like on an annual basis if we were to take a growing period and a non-growing period survey, for instance, and how does that ground cover change over even just annually, but then over time. The data is then tabulated, and we can start to look at links between the measurements. So a really important part here is also looking on either side of the fence. And that's a bit of an education thing for us. So each side of the fence can have really different management techniques or priorities. And so we're making sure within this study that we're getting some kind of active farmland, but we're also getting some of this land that, or some of this ground that might have been fenced off for conservation value or to plant a shelter belt, for instance, and those sorts of things. So what we're able to do with this is by embracing these numbers, we can start to see how, just on a basic terms, how healthy a landscape might be. And we can start to then kind of rank them or not rank them necessarily, but start to see where they sit in a bit of a sliding scale of resilience. And so on the left-hand side of the screen here, of our 5 sites, this has kind of come out notionally as the most resilient site through the management techniques that are being applied there. And then as we move through, depending on the landscape practice and the landscape management, we're starting to see, how, I suppose, how the effects of active management or not having active management can actually affect a landscape. So if we use this one, for instance, what I want to point out here is this particular site did a very, very important job this is a sugar gum plantation, and it played its role by pushing the water table down and fixing some significant salinity issues. But what we're finding now is that it's got really great insect numbers, for instance, and bird numbers about this time of year, which pushes its average right up. But it actually isn't quite as resilient as the rest of the landscapes right throughout the year as an average, because as you can see in the photo here, there's very little mid-story. So a lot of the water that kind of hits this area will push right out. There's very little kind of biodiversity value through the ground because there's no ground cover, and it's highly compacted now as well because a lot of that root system is too deep to really kind of help the soil and the soil biology. So it's a really great example of how active management needs to change through the years, or through the life of a program, in order to continue to help biodiversity move forward as well. If we look to the middle here, this particular property, we've got 3 things in this photo going on and 3 different kind of management techniques. One of which is if we look over here, it's been fenced off for conservation purposes. So this kind of gets crash grazed every now and again, but it's not necessarily part of the farming system. And it's supporting some significant numbers of kind of biodiversity values and biodiversity numbers. So we're seeing a lot of insects in here, a lot of smaller birds. To the top right of this photograph, we're seeing that we've got a kind of pretty set stocked paddock, and we're seeing that in its numbers as well. So highly compacted. Often the ground cover is suffering, and as you can see, we've kind of got some of these soil, this kind of soil exposure. Down here near this kind of dam, again, it's very different. So this is a perennial type block, or a perennial planting it's been planted with saltbush. It's rotationally grazed with a smaller flock, and what we're seeing here is this is taking or giving us greater numbers of insects, greater numbers of reptiles, and overall we're seeing kind of greater kind of agricultural benefits or enterprise benefits, and we're seeing greater benefits for biodiversity, through this area, even though it's actively farmed for livestock, so on pasture. So the key takeaways here, I suppose, we need to really understand and really keep in mind that landscapes vary, and it's really important to understand how it functions, or how it's functioning on a catchment, micro-catchment scale, and what it needs in order to kind of create a functional landscape system that can really benefit community dynamics and biodiversity within that system. It's also really important to understand what the needs are and what it needs to achieve. So when we're talking about private land or agriculture in that kind of farming space, what's the enterprise and what can these sorts of gains kind of provide? But what do you need out of it as an enterprise, kind of out of enterprise land, as well as how can it kind of provide opportunity for biodiversity? Building in climate and genetic adaptation through all projects is so vital now. Being selective with your provenance, placing an importance on seed stock. So ask your nursery or your supplier where the seed stock is coming from, and you can be really hard with that sometimes. You can ask for different seed stock to make sure that you've got that resilience and you've got that genetic diversity. Make a point of including rare or threatened and underrepresented species. So whether that's in year 1 or whether that's in year 5 or year 10, we really need to kind of keep that in mind. It's important to know what you're managing and be able to set those goals to achieve good landscape outcomes. And decision-making tools that we've been through today can kind of help with that. So being able to stick to that system, but being able to adapt that management is really crucial. I think what we're seeing more and more now is, in any kind of regard, the link between soil management or ground management and the opportunities for biodiversity really is vital. So that might be keeping ground cover and ground litter, maximising that root profile even through natives, or kind of maximising opportunity for functioning ecosystems is really vital. And healthy soils really do provide that foundation for biodiversity, for landscape function, and the benefits within that, like resilient landscape systems. So that's a wrap for me. I realise I've gone over time as well, but I'll hand that back to you, Pauline. And thanks everybody for the opportunity to talk to you all about some of my crazy ideas.
Oh, heck, you're in with another crazy group of people, Danny, so that's all fine. Maybe we can try and pop your camera on now, because thanks for turning it off during the presentation. That really did help the slide progression, but it's nice to see your face now. Thanks for that. There's just so much in there, and we've got a question in the chat, and I've got a couple for myself, but I'll start with the one in the chat, which is around, and I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong. Is it Balbalunet?
Balbalunet, yes.
Excellent, that case study. And the question is, what forms the baseline diversity in abundance? Is it the ecological vegetation classes? And what happens when those EVCs maybe disagree with what you're assessing?
That is a great question, Annie. I love it. So we did a lot of work on this, and it is really an important thing to understand that EVCs aren't necessarily right. You need to ground or correct. They give a snapshot, but you really do need to ground truth what's going on in that landscape. And so that assessment became a number of factors for us. The EVC was one of those, but then Damien Cook, a really wonderful ecologist who has spent so many years up in that area. We also leaned on Damien a bit to have a bit of a conversation and have a bit of a yarn about that and develop the species selection around that. And the traditional owner group was also really crucial in that too. So having a conversation with them and understanding, just getting an idea of some of the stories and some of the historic kind of stories and information that they hold, but also what they wanted to see from the landscape. So there was a whole range of kind of collaboration that went on in selecting for that particular project, as well as actually ground truthing that site and understanding what it was. So that particular site is much higher in the landscape at Lake Balbal there, and it's a sandy lunette. So that particular area is really, really different in its ecology and in its function to what's on either side of it. And that was really important to understand as well. Either side, there were boxes, there was kind of woodland species right around it that just wouldn't have been appropriate in that 3.5 hectares of land. So some others could have gone in there and planted it out with all of those, but there would have been very little success. The other really key component of that was we actually selected for that particular, the kind of function of that lunette. So on the higher ground, a lot of the Cassarinas went into a lot of the higher ground along with some Pittosporum and those sorts of things. On one side, it was mainly chenopod kind of landscape, so a lot of salt bushes went in. And then on the other side, on the eastern side, I think that's what I'm going to call it anyway, it was a bit more woodland-like. So a bit more Pittosporum went in, the Colochus went in, some Myoporum went in, Cattlebush went in. It was actually a really interesting project because it had about 4 ecotones in itself just because of its slope and its kind of place in the landscape. So that was a very, very, in some ways, it was a very complex decision-making process that went around that, which actually gave a really great opportunity to use that framework and develop it a little bit more. Oh, I'm not sure if you're on mute or if I've lost sound.
That was me. Yes, I was on mute. My clever joke was that you were providing a perfect segue, which is now, not really as relevant anymore since my muting incident. But people are interested in how they might utilise or get in touch with the Plains plant selection matrix that you described before.
Yeah, great. Great question. That is that's a tricky one at the moment. So this is it's kind of available in like Excel sheet that we're just trying to provide some kind of way to read. At the moment, it's not very readable for people, and it requires a bit of talking through and a bit of consultancy within that. It's also been developed on, absolutely developed on the smell of an oily rag. So to be really clear, LPLN have contributed to the project, but within my own kind of interests and passions, there's been countless hours go into, night times go into it, putting the little one to bed and then, walking out and revisiting the computer and revisiting that work. So what I ideally would love is to create a kind of website platform or web platform that can hold the framework and hold the matrix and be able to do what it's intended to do, which is make those decisions or assist in that decision-making process. But for ease or answering the question, perhaps not ease for me, because maybe I'll get a bit more work to do, is to call me and we can discuss it and then kind of put it together in that way, or get in touch via email or via the London Plains Landcare Network contact details, and then I can get a copy out to you. Yep.
Yeah, sounds good. We might put people in touch with your email potentially. Yeah, that'd be great.
Anybody out there that wants to fund it though, totally happy to talk.
Yeah. Bring in the dollars, people. I'm particularly interested because the Wimmera has a huge amount of cropping in its landscape, less so than mixed farms with grazing, and the biodiversity story is a bit more challenging, I suppose. So I'm really curious about that property that you had in the selection, and what did that mean? Particularly, some of the things I really enjoyed hearing about was having the shelter belt or the arcs in there that you talked about of 200 metres apart and 50 metres wide. Implementing that onto broad scale agriculture, I know people who would have a heart attack in front of me if we sort of spoke about those things. What more might you have to say on those mixes, cropping and what you've been talking about?
Yeah, sure. It's that kind of goes to the heart of what I'm calling the invisible surplus and identifying the invisible surplus. So particularly with cropping, because it's not as easy to kind of do these things perhaps in a cropping system as it is in a pasture-based system. What we're starting to explore and what we'd like to develop further, and we're kind of moving into this area, is we're seeing technology run at such a rate now that we can push a drone over the top of a cropping enterprise and do some multispectral work in NDVI monitoring and analysis, as well as what we call VARI analysis. And what that can start to do is we can start to just really analyse what, along with header data that's being spat out from pretty modern tractors now and headers now, we can see where the yield is perhaps dropping under what it's costing to establish or to maintain. And we can really start to identify that kind of marginal ground, and then look at what we're trying to develop now is going, okay, well, if it's not going to cost you much to probably take that out of your cropping regime or take that out of your cropping schedule. So maybe let's start there, take it out, but what we then want to do is start to put the value on that, as Jim was talking about as well. So we want to emphasise the value that something like that can bring, and that might be that really good croppers who have got some amazing shelter belt systems in. You can see it when you drive down the road, for instance, where the wind, these kind of beautifully designed things, you can see where the wind touches the crop, because usually you get that drop in growth. And so we want to start to really establish what that means around. And Jim, perhaps you and I need to have a chat about that, how we actually monetize that. But we want to see or start to, I suppose, provide that value to farming systems and enterprises to go, okay, well, look, if you put that in, then it's actually going to protect you like this, or you might actually find that you'll go to grain fill a bit better because the plant is getting a lot more moisture out of the ground. You're stopping your surface water, so it's permeating your crop a lot better and a lot easier. And you're also kind of providing this wind buffer, so the plant isn't fighting as hard to kind of survive in the elements, and it can put all of that kind of I suppose all of its ability or all of its energy into going to grain fill. So there's a lot more work to be done there, but that's where I can start to see the benefits of these types of things coming in, as well as wild pollination is such an untapped kind of resource for us, and being able to put these 50-metre wide arc blocks in that can start to break up your wind, hold some really good insect populations, hold some bat populations, some woodland bird populations. That becomes your arc, that becomes your pollinator station. So putting a value on that kind of natural pollination of kind of flowering crops I think is really vital as well. And the research for that just we continue to learn more. So I suppose in a nutshell or in summary of that, it's looking for those small gains in that invisible surplus that you can make that allow you to maybe drop your inputs. It might be diesel, it might be seed, it might be other things, but push your overall enterprise up.
No, absolutely. It'd be great to, because paddock trees are such a beautiful resource that is really hard to replace, very, very old ones, and incorporating that into, the existing, into new vegetation using that would be wonderful. And there's some farmers that we can think of that have some really innovative ways at composting on a massive scale, and they're reaping the benefits in the really challenging years, but they've never measured it. So both of your talks today would really be interesting if they were sort of analysed. And you also bring to mind, my sister-in-law sent me a picture not that long ago of land care in Germany, which is putting flowering plants next to crops because they're having pretty significant pollination issues themselves. One more question before we stop, Danny, and that was about just the reaction to landholders to the monitoring methods and what the general adoption has been like for your program.
Yeah, great question. We're still pretty early stages with this, so I've got a bit of a date to kind of sit down with the landholders. They've been really great in being interested in it and trying to understand what the program's doing. And what I have seen across that kind of across the lifetime already is that the landholders their knowledge is developing around. They're amazed at perhaps how many insects come up in the count, or they go, it's something as simple as, oh wow, okay, right, the moisture kind of retention in that area is so much better in that area. We can have a discussion around that, and we can start to talk about why that's happening. So we're starting to see some of the landholders really turn around and really start to want to understand how perhaps they can start to I suppose find those opportunities, but manage towards greater enterprise benefit and biodiversity benefit. So really, really early days, and I wish we could do more, and I hope to do more in the coming year or coming years. At the moment, it's been a pretty good, pretty interested kind of take up.
Oh, great. It's one of those days when we could just stay and talk longer, but we did promise we'd finish at about 12:30, so here we are. There is one last shout out. So we've got Libby Robbins, who contacted us, who also presented at our Little Desert conference a little while ago, saying a special hi to Jim, who visited the Little Desert with her in 1990. That's a warm and fuzzy one to leave us on. But thanks so much, Danny. Thanks so much, Jim. It's been great. You'll be able to watch this again, everybody else, on Swift, and tell your mates too if they missed out. We're getting the productions up sort of fairly quickly, so within the next few weeks. But thanks so much to you both. Really enjoyable, and thanks everyone for joining.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.